A lot of people on both the left and the right are more than ever convinced that Israel and the Jews are the answer to every question about what's wrong with the world. So it's hardly surprising that they are sure that American foreign policy in the Middle East and the current war in Iran has similarly been dictated by the whims of Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu, or the mythical, all-powerful Israel lobby, or the vast Jewish conspiracy that is at the heart of so much anti-Semitic invective. The truth about the U.S.-Israel relationship has always been much less exciting for both Jews and their opponents. America has always made alliances and waged war to pursue its own interests, not those of the Jewish state, and that is as true now as it ever was. Today, on Think Twice, we take a deep dive into the U.S.-Israel relationship and the war on Iran with one of the leading authorities on American foreign policy, historian and Wall Street Journal columnist, Walter Russell Mead. Hello, and welcome to Think Twice. More than 2 weeks into a war on Iran, Americans remain divided on its merits as Israelis are united behind the effort to destroy Tehran's nuclear and missile programs and to force it to give up its support for international terrorism. Yet the real problem here is not so much a disagreement on whether the goals of the joint U.S.-Israeli offensive are desirable, as it is a perception among a large number of Americans that anything President Donald Trump does is bad, and that Israel and its supporters drag the United States into a war that it shouldn't be fighting. Opposition to anything Trump chooses to do was always inevitable in a political climate in which his opponents are convinced he's an authoritarian fascist. But the refusal to back a military effort against the world's leading state sponsor of terror that seeks nuclear weapons and ballistic missiles to spread their version of extremist Islam around the world is redolent of more than just knee-jerk partisanship. It's also reflective of the way the Democratic Party has turned on Israel and the way an element of the GOP has embraced an anti-Semitic worldview promoted by popular podcasters like Tucker Carlson. That's appalling in and of itself, but the fact that both left-wingers and some on the right still believe in myths about Israel or the Jews manipulating U.S. foreign policy is at the root of the problem. Why do so many people prefer to think their country is being led around the nose by a small ally when the truth is that this president, like his predecessors, is pursuing his own agenda and ideas about American interests and not that of Israel? To break this down, we're honored to have back with us today one of the most insightful analysts of the history of U.S. foreign policy. Walter Russell Mead is a distinguished fellow in strategy and statesmanship at the Hudson Institute, the Global View columnist at the Wall Street Journal, and the Alexander Hamilton Professor of Strategy and Statecraft with the Hamilton School for Classical and Civic Education at the University of Florida. He's authored numerous books, including the 2004 Special Providence, American Foreign Policy and How It Changed the World, and the 2022 The Ark of a Covenant, the United States, Israel, and the Fate of the Jewish People. Walter Russell Mead, welcome back to Think Twice.
It's great to be here.
Well, Mr. Mead, thanks so much for taking the time to join us today. I want to start by asking you the question that was at the heart of your seminal work on the U.S.-Israel relationship that was published in 2022 when you were last on this podcast, but which now seems more important than ever. Why is it so important for so many people on the left and the right to think that a strategic problem involving Iran that every U.S. president has acknowledged as a U.S. vital interest is merely a function of the influence of the Israel lobby, Jews, or the Israeli government?
Yeah. Well, it is certainly, we're certainly seeing a lot of it, of that kind of conspiracy thinking right now. And you know, part of it is, of course, that the war in Iran U.S. participation in a conflict with Iran does help Israel, and people can't help but notice that, and they can't help but notice that Israelis are happy that the United States is doing this. And to the average American who thinks, you know, We are an exporter of oil. Iran is thousands of miles away. It's not immediately obvious why the United States is getting involved in this or why we're doing all of these things. And so what you have is you have a real question that people would legitimately ask, particularly people who don't follow foreign affairs all that closely or have a lot of detailed background about the history of American foreign policy. And let's remember, something like less than 1% of the population daily reads one of the major national newspapers. So we're talking about people whose sort of font of specific in-depth information is not high. And so here we have all these people ready to jump in with an explanation. It's the Jews. How, what other explanation do you need? And for all kinds of cultural and historical reasons, there are lots of people who, they find that an attractive conspiracy theory. It's, that it has resonated in history in various ways. It keeps coming up. There are certainly lots of voices on the internet and in other places willing to express this, including some people who are well-known and at least until recently somewhat well-respected. So I'm not surprised. I'm sorry that it exists. I'm not surprised.
Yeah. Well, back in 2022, you wrote that what we all needed, both supporters of Israel and its opponents, was a, quote, less Jew-centric view of Zionist history and of America's engagement with the Zionist project. But if anything, the obsession with the Jews in Israel has only grown since then. Why has belief in the myth of the Israel lobby not merely persisted, but essentially metastasized since 2022 with the mainstream left and the far right more obsessed with Israel than ever? What does it say about the political culture of this country that so many of the same myths about Israel and Jewish influence that, as far as I'm concerned, you so conclusively debunked in your book, seem only to have gained ground?
Yeah, well, not enough people read my book. I
was thinking the same thing.
We need for more people to read my book. But I think if you look at the history, and obviously I wrote the book before the attacks of October 2023, and then before all of the kinds of responses to that and so on. But you can see a bunch of trends in American history that tell us when the fever of anti-Semitism, there are certain factors that seem to increase the prevalence, the appeal of anti-Semitic myths and conspiracy theories, urban legends, whatever. Because basically when things are going well, when people feel that things are going well in America, America is working, their lives are good, anti-Semitism just fades out to the fringes. There may be people who have these attitudes, but they're not acting on them. It's not a big deal. And then most people, again, if you're happy, you don't ask, why do I have a problem? Because you don't have a problem, you're happy. And we have several things that are going on, I think, in the United States today that historically have triggered anti-Semitic episodes. One of them is immigration, that historically, even when Jews have been a fairly small proportion of immigration, large numbers of immigrants coming into the country, in terms of a percentage of the population, do make people start asking, who are we? What is my identity? And make them nervous and jumpy about people who might not seem to be exactly the same as me. And so we see after in the 1840s, there was a lot of immigration, most of it actually from Ireland with the potato famine, and then Germany after the failure of the revolutions of 1848. And some of those German refugees were Jewish, but most weren't. And most of the Irish, of course, none of the Irish immigrants were Jewish. But you do see more anti-Semitism running around in the United States in the 40s and 50s, along with other anti-immigrant movements. Then after the Civil War, this very much kind of subsides, and you have a generation where American Jews are pretty well accepted. You're sort of back to the historical norm of Jews living side by side with other people, and nobody making that much of a deal about it either way. But with what I've called the great wave of immigration from late 1880s through the World War I, you actually get a much higher percentage of foreign-born people living in the United States from many different cultures. Again, not predominantly a Jewish wave of migration.
Yeah.
But Jews were part of this. And in fact, the majority of American Jews today are descended from the predominantly Russian and Eastern Jews who came into the United States during those years. And you did see a tremendous rise in anti-Semitic sentiment. You saw for the first time segregation against Jews in hotels. Sort of New York Jews whose families had been in the country for hundreds of years are suddenly surprised to find they're not allowed into the same hotels that their non-Jewish friends are still welcome in. You get the Ku Klux Klan becomes not just a Southern anti-Black phenomenon, but a Northern phenomenon. Again, a lot of the resentment is anti-Catholic because the Catholics were a much higher percentage. Nevertheless, Jews figure in this.
And the populist wave of the 1890s is part of this as well.
Right? I was going to come around to the economic side, but I wanted to get the migration thing firmly in people's minds because we are now, this is the highest level of foreign-born adults in the United States in our history, higher than the World War I era peak. And so it is not surprising in the questions of nativism. You hear people talking about the Great Replacement and other kinds of things. It is just not surprising that this would happen. It's also just not surprising that even though Jews are not a part of this great migrant wave in any significant way, anti-Semitism gets triggered. So that's part of it. Then, yes, as you say, with the populism, significant waves of economic change that affect the way that millions of people make their living, challenge their security, challenge their sense of the continuity of their communities, of their ways of life. And in the populist movement of the 1880s and 90s is a very good example where you had with the Industrial Revolution and also with the changes in the farming economy, you had lots of people losing their farms, falling into debt, living standards going down. And the populist movement, which was a kind of protest movement against capitalism, protest movement against the big industrial trusts, the railroads, and so on, fastens also on the Jews. Finance capital, the Jews, the banks.
Yeah, so Rothschilds.
Yeah. Yes, exactly. The Rothschilds really figure in people's imaginations at this time. And we have William Jennings Bryan's famous speech, "Thou shalt not crucify mankind upon a cross of gold," obviously an anti-Semitic dog whistle. And now today in the United States, what you're having is the combination of a very, very strong immigration surge combined with a lot of economic uncertainty and economic change. So these are things that clearly in the past have triggered a lot of anti-Semitism. I don't think that we should be particularly surprised, though I don't think that we should be happy, that the same factors are driving some of the same phenomena.
Yeah, I think that's very, everything old is new. Thanks for tuning in to Think Twice. Whether you're listening to us on any of the podcast platforms or watching us live on Facebook or X or on the JNS YouTube channel, please like and or subscribe to JNS, click on the bell for notifications, and give us good reviews. Also, in addition to Think Twice, there is a Jonathan Tobin Daily podcast where I share more news and analysis with you about the most significant issues we're facing today. You can find The Daily Show under Jonathan Tobin Daily on the JNS channel, wherever you get your podcasts. And now, back to today's program. We see it manifesting itself differently on the left, where it seems to be rooted more in sort of intersectional ideology. But what do you make of the civil war that seems to be raging on the right about Israel and anti-Semitism? Political culture where gatekeeping is reviled and transgressive behavior is the path to clicks and popularity on the internet. Was this also inevitable?
Well, first of all, I just saw a poll this morning that saw that 90% of Republicans support the war in Iran. Mm. And I saw that, and I'm seeing that Republican attitudes toward Israel have really changed, maybe dropped 2% in the last 5 years, Republican favorable ratio. Now, there are a lot of polls, but I did notice these today. And that does suggest to me that on the right, the phenomenon seems to be less a mass phenomenon than a phenomenon of a particular segment of the right. One that it may not be, or is becoming, I think, more visible, particularly with the internet and so on. But at least if you look at the big numbers, it doesn't seem to be having the same kind of public effect. That it's on the left that the sort of conflation of capitalism, Israel, American Jews as not being enthusiastically progressive enough, even though, of course, many American Jews are extremely progressive, that has kind of solidified. Now, I'm not trying to minimize the issues on the right or to say there aren't significant problems with a real potential for growth. I just say when I look at the polling, what I see is that changes in attitudes toward Israel and are far deeper and more widely spread on the left right now.
Yeah, I think that's right. And I think that's manifests itself sort of politically in the way that the Democratic Party seems to have largely abandoned Israel.
Right.
The question is, if that isn't happening on the right, have we been mistaking sort of YouTube views for Tucker Carlson's podcast for votes, in a party where, as he reminds us, quite frequently, the only person who counts is Donald Trump.
Right.
And as long as Donald Trump is with Israel, Tucker Carlson, Candace Owens, Megyn Kelly, whoever you were talking about, their views just don't count as much, and they don't have as much support as perhaps their ratings would lead us to believe.
Yeah, and again, I think we shouldn't forget that a lot of people see news as entertainment rather than as serious. I'm trying to understand what's going on in the world here. Mm-hmm. So that they follow an individual star the way they would follow Taylor Swift or something, and listen to someone who is entertaining without necessarily connecting what that person is saying on the screen with real life or their feelings about their neighbor who happens to be Jewish or whatever. And it doesn't mean that this kind of thing can't have an impact over time as people listen and sort of begin to move in a certain direction. But I think we should not overestimate the degree to which the average person gets sucked down the rabbit hole into conspiracy theories and so on. I'm not trying to minimize dangers, but not everybody is aggressively online. And many of the people who are online are not serious about they view their online time as entertainment more than anything else. I think we should be concerned, and certainly we look at attacks on synagogues, on individual Jews, and so on, and we have to regard that with the utmost seriousness. If this is going to be getting worse, we're still at the early stages of that kind of phenomenon. And I would agree with you that President Trump, his very strong pro-Israel stance, and his very strong stance against anti-Semitism is a significant factor. does make you wonder what would happen if that goes away, or when ultimately President Trump leaves politics. What happens then? That's a question.
Yeah. Well, I think it's a question that Tucker Carlson seemed to think he had the answer to, but we'll see how that goes. But it does lead to my next question, which is taking, sort of the Republican Civil War, the Democrats out of this. Why do you think Israel has lost ground in the battle for public opinion in the United States since October 7th? Certainly, it hasn't lost as much ground on the political right as sort of the, anti-Semitic podcasters would have it, but it has lost ground. Is this mostly about the power of ideology, the media, something else? What do you see it as?
I think again, we can look at the last prolonged military engagement was the Lebanon War back in the 80s. And at that time, Israeli favorability actually declined pretty significantly in the United States. And you would see a lot of articles. If you go back then and you look, you'll see articles about, is Israel losing the younger generation? Because in fact, many of the people who reacted most strongly were younger people. So
who are no longer young.
Who are no longer young. But let's note that this is the longest war. It's really starting with October 23. This is the longest, largely continuous war in Israel's history ever. And that for much of the war, this is the first few days of the war were dominated by stories of Palestinian atrocities, Hamas atrocities in Israel. But after that, the big news is Israel bombing Gaza and bombing Gaza and bombing Gaza and bombing Gaza. And even people who in the beginning, their impression of what goes on was dominated by, what was done to Israelis. After a while, this kind of steady diet, the scenes of devastation. And of course, there was a lot of manipulation and so on in this. But just generally speaking, there's a natural instinct of people who aren't themselves parties to a conflict to identify with the people whose houses are getting bombed rather than with the people dropping the bombs. So I think, it's not entirely inexplicable that over a long war in which, again, thanks to the way Hamas fights the war, civilians used as human shields, schools, hospitals, houses, all of these things, are targets in war. And you see the tremendous devastation. It's just not surprising that the average non-engaged person would find sympathy drifting toward what would be seen as those who suffer rather than those who inflict.
Yeah. Turning back to Iran, do you think the war that began more than 2 weeks ago when we're taping this can be won? Or are the economic and strategic costs for sustaining it too high to justify stopping Iran from obtaining nuclear weapons, something that, ought to be a consensus issue, but perhaps isn't?
Look, it's, in any war, the first thing you have to acknowledge is that you just don't know. Is Iran on the brink of collapse and just, 2 more days and everything falls apart? Or does Iran have 25 years of fighting left in it, and that we could have ground troops patrolling in Iran for 20 years like in Afghanistan, but at the end, the mullahs would come back? We have no way of knowing these things. And so it's kind of, we're all making, we're having opinions, we're making decisions in the presence of insufficient knowledge. And I think that humility has to kind of be with us at all times here. That said, I think I've talked about 3 different types of outcomes in this war. One would be regime change, either a genuinely moderate faction that is rooted in the current ruling elite takes power, which is willing to say, okay, fine, no nuclear program, no ballistic missiles, no subversion. We're going to have Shia paradise in one country. Let's say the Trotskyite wing of the Iranian Revolution.
It's an interesting way to put it, but yeah.
The Stalinist wing, Shiism in one country. Or alternatively and better, a more democratic or at least non-theocratic opposition somehow manages to take control in Iran. That's the sort of highest level of success. And what that could potentially offer would be the integration of an Iran that was actually somewhat favorable to Israel and the U.S. rather than profoundly opposed as a new and different factor in Middle Eastern politics. Would be nice. I don't know that how likely it is. We can't say. Doesn't seem all that likely, but who knows? Things can happen. As Herodotus, they said in Herodotus, the horse can learn to sing a hymn. Who knows? So there's that. Then there's a kind of median scene scenario where I've called it in my journal column the mother of all lawnmowers, which doesn't solve anything. Leaves the same regime that is in charge now in charge, obviously with different personnel, but same outlook on life. But their ability to, their infrastructure, their economic position and so on has been so damaged that even with the worst will in the world, it's a number of years before they can sort of get back to actually doing things that threaten the neighborhood. That would be not a total victory, but it would be a significant enhancement of the status quo. Obviously, you might have to mow the lawn again in a few years, but okay. And then the worst outcome would be that President Trump comes to the conclusion, or his advisors tell him, that there's no way to clear the Strait of Hormuz or otherwise end Iran's ability to cause trouble in the region without reaching a political agreement with this current regime, so that there's a negotiated end in which it is seen that they have not only survived, but to some degree managed to extract some sort of price for ending their activities in the Straits and in the region. That, I think, would be a significant setback, would have very extensive consequences, and that that's what I hope we don't see.
Yeah.
So which of these three is the most likely? I think probably number two, the mother of all lawnmowers. The military part seems to be going very well. But the other two scenarios remain possible.
Right. Focusing on American reactions to the war in Iran, I'm wondering if the real disagreement about the war is it so much about strategic issues, or is it just a function of partisanship? Given that a lot of Democrats, if not most of them, truly think Trump is an authoritarian fascist and must be resisted rather than merely opposed. Is bipartisan agreement on any issue, including, foreign policy, with the expression, it used to end at the politics ends at the shore line. Is that really possible these days on any war or any issue, let alone a war like the one in Iran?
Well, it makes it more difficult, but we should not forget that both the Biden and the Obama administrations did not want a war with Iran and did not start a war with Iran. And so I think this, we can't simply say that if a Democratic president were in office now, more Democrats would be supportive of a war, because probably the Democratic president wouldn't be in a war.
Yeah, they were kicking it down. Their policy was to kick it down,
right,
kick the can down the road, or just appease Iran.
We can describe it however we want, but the policy was that a war in Iran would be with Iran would be an enormous disaster for the United States, and at all costs is something to avoid, while attempting also to avoid the Iranian nuclear bomb. So presumably a Kamala Harris administration would have followed that path. So in that sense, Iran policy is one of the major dividing lines in American politics and has been since the JCPOA and the Obama administration, where almost all the Senate Republicans signed a letter to the Ayatollah from Tom Cotton saying, don't believe this agreement because, in fact, it's not a treaty and a Republican administration won't follow it. So I don't think you can be surprised at all that the Democrats out of office oppose a policy that they opposed when they were in office, and the Republicans in office are supporting a policy that they suppose that they supported out of office. So the partisanship makes it all hotter, and means that many Democrats see the war in the context of Trump's, what they would see as Trump's sort of, multifaceted assault on constitutional norms. But the heart of it is an objection they would have had no matter if Jeb Bush were president, we're fighting this war.
That's an interesting counterfactual scenario. Jeb Bush. Don't hear that name very often anymore. But do you think this administration has the ability to stick to its position on Iran, or will economic and political considerations, essentially bail out the Islamist regime and sooner or later force Trump to give up before his objectives are achieved? That number 3 scenario you spoke about. Obviously, the midterm elections weigh very heavily on Republicans, and the price of gas, which is inevitably going up because of, any kind of war in the Middle East, let alone something that affects, the flow of oil. Can he stick to his guns on this?
You are asking me to answer a question that no living human being can answer. It's the future. It all depends. There is certainly some number of weeks, months, or years beyond which no American president would continue a campaign that was going nowhere and so on. But what is that number? And what is the number for Trump? And what are the chances that the Iranians, the number of the weeks, months, and days that the Iranians can hold out is less?
Yeah,
can't tell
that's another. Those are 2 variables that we don't know the answer.
Right, two X's, neither of which, 2 unknowns, neither of which we can say much about. I think it's clear that so far, every time Trump has sort of had had an opportunity or made an opportunity to speak to the public about the war, he said, well, I think it's going to end soon, and I don't want it to go on forever, but I'm not going to stop until I get what I want. Which you're as good as interpreting this, I think, as I am, and our listeners are as well. This is it's a question. It's we don't know.
Yeah, and a lot hinges on it. In one of your recent columns, you noted, just the position of great strength that Iran had in 2023. And since October 7th, which was, in no small measure part of its policy of fomenting, chaos around the region and its hegemonic ambitions, it has done nothing but lose. Was this hubris, trying to put it in historical perspective, was it the hubris of the theocrats in Tehran, or just baked into the cake because their ideology will always impel them to wage war on the West and Israel?
Well, I think, I've heard some people think that maybe Hamas jumped the gun, that the Iranians wanted a more propitious time when they could have had some other things ready, so that, Hamas being impetuous and with its own agenda, in a sense, it was taking Iranian support, but didn't want to take Iranian orders. Maybe.
And Hezbollah's, half-hearted response,
right,
which was terrible enough from the point of view of people living in northern Israel. But
remember that back at the time of the 1967 war, Nasser really wasn't looking for war as much as Syria was in some ways. He was kind of pushed into a war by an impetuous ally. That happens a lot in international politics. So we don't know. But in any case, the way things worked out, the first the attacks solidified Israeli opinion about, okay, we're in a real war for survival here. We cannot fool around. We have to deal with this. There was a big struggle in Israel over, do we attack Hezbollah in the beginning or not? And I think wisely, as it has turned out, the Israelis decided, no, first make a lot of progress in Gaza, then deal with Hezbollah. I think that was a success on the whole. And that meant that sort of Iran's two most powerful agents in the Levant, on the Mediterranean, had been weakened. And we should not forget the somewhat unexpected collapse of the Syrian government, which kind of knocked the center out of the Iranian. That was the sort of center stone of the arc, the keystone of the arc.
Yeah, the land bridge to the Mediterranean that they had crafted with Iraq.
Right, and that was something that, frankly, nobody, people didn't expect, and wasn't entirely, the idea that Sunni Islamists could be running Syria wasn't necessarily the Israeli dream for the future either.
No, not at all. Yeah.
So as often in the Middle East, other events intrude, but in any case, Iran can really now only look at Iraq and, the militias in Iraq and the Houthis as kind of proxies who are still in relatively good shape. And that's a big fall for them. It's not nothing, as we've seen. I'm not sure that we may hear from the Houthis again as...
Although, their silence in this war is certainly a bad side for Iran, as if they've decided they don't want to go down with the ship with the Ayatollahs.
Right, but maybe that's what they're deciding, or maybe they were waiting until a lot of the oil commerce started shifting to the Red Sea. When it's much more fun to be a Houthi picking targets when you have 100 super tankers in the Red Sea. Who knows? We do not, honestly, we don't know. So, at least I don't know, and I suspect you also don't know. We're not reading.
Well, that's why I'm asking the question.
Right. And I'm sorry to have to keep saying, I don't know, but I think in wartime especially, we all need to be careful about what we claim to know and what we don't. But I could see that the Houthis, yes, you can interpret what they're doing as they think Iran is kind of a loser and they're looking to cut some kind of other deal. Or alternatively, they're waiting to really come in at the moment of maximum vulnerability on the part of global oil shipments.
Well, we'll see about that. One of my favorite insights from your book, The Ark of the Covenant, was your description of the peace process between Israel and the Palestinians as the MacGuffin in U.S. Middle East policy for decades. And in other words, the term from the Hitchcock movies, but something that we're obsessed about, but which actually doesn't have any great meaning. What is it about the situation in Iran, which is now, sort of fascinating and focused Americans on? Is there a MacGuffin there that is similarly a diversion that we're just not seeing, that we're being fooled by, do you think?
Well, I think for a long time there was this hope of a grand bargain between the sort of Ayatollah Iran and the United States. In many, many ways, the United States and Iran are two countries that ought to be, would both actually benefit from a positive relationship. Iran is a non-Arab, non-Sunni country in a region where it's got a nuclear Sunni neighbor, Pakistan, and where it faces a certain amount of entrenched hostility from Sunni and Arab neighbors. During the Cold War under the Shah, Iran, Turkey, and Turkey both were countries that had good relations with the U.S. out of worries in part about pan-Arab nationalism, plus common fears of the Soviet Union. I think that the people in the U.S. who hoped that they could find a moderate group among the supporters of the current regime who are willing to let national interests find common national interests so that they could at least have a reasonable relationship with the United States. That was the dream that I think certainly in the Obama years and the Biden years was guiding a lot of policy. And there were plenty of Iranians willing to kind of play that role. We're the moderates. We need a few things from you to help us win the internal battle. The moderate Americans and the moderate Iranians are both working against the hardliners in our own country. You need to help us win our battles so that we can help you win your battle, and then we get to a great place. I think that was always based on a misreading of the realities of the Iranian politics, and the politics in particular of the regime, where being the sort of lead spear in the resistance against Israel, the resistance against America, was actually a way for the regime to achieve a certain amount of theological and cultural legitimacy inside Iran, but also in the wider Middle East. And that was not something they were prepared to let go of. There was the illusion of the grand bargain with the mullahs, I think, very much like the illusion perhaps of a grand bargain with Putin, that similarly American presidents for many years in both parties had chased.
That's kind of a traditional foreign policy, myth that sort of haunts Americans. I mean, if you think back to the era of the Soviets, we're always hearing about, the moderates in the Kremlin, and let's help them against the hardliners, when in fact that division wasn't always real. And I guess we're always looking for that wherever we go, looking to see our own, reasonableness mirrored even in our opponents, when that isn't really the case.
See, if you're going to have a successful career in America in life, one of the things you have to get good at is thinking about win-win solutions. America's a rich country. There's a lot of opportunity here. Very, very often there are ways that both sides domestically can achieve a lot if they just each compromise on a few issues. And so the people who rise to senior positions in the United States tend to be people who have come up through this process of accommodation, compromise, forward, constructive thinking, understanding the other, building bridges. And it's a great skill, and it does actually often plays out okay. I mean, America has more allies than either China or North Korea. It's not without merit in international relations. But you do occasionally come up into situations where it doesn't work. And what you see is a lot of people continue to conform to their kind of, default programming or personal life experience or whatever you want to call it in situations where it's not appropriate. And I think we've seen that a lot in U.S. policy with Iran.
Mm. You have defined President Trump's worldview as Jacksonian, essentially, as distinct from traditional foreign policy realism or neoconservatism. But is this still a Jacksonian foreign policy that he is pursuing, or is it just a different variation?
I think he's still, I think he very much is somebody who, we see he doesn't really care much about spreading American ideology. He thinks American capitalism is terrific, thinks America is the greatest country on earth, but doesn't necessarily think that everybody else is going to be like America. And probably at some level, he's glad that they aren't, because that would make them much more formidable as competitors. If they were as good as we are, we would have a harder time being number one. So, he isn't trying to turn Venezuela into a democracy. He's not talking about making Cuba a democracy. He's made clear to the Ayatollahs and the IRGC that if people were willing to make a deal with him, he's ready to engage in the most pragmatic way with Putin, with Xi. He is he does not believe in a kind of imposing an American ideological agenda on the rest of the world, which in some ways, it makes it easier dealing with some countries, with some of our European partners and allies, and some others. Actually makes it harder, because for them, the ideology is very important and a very important part of foreign policy. So it, like everything else, you win some, you lose some. But he's also, he continues to, many of his themes very much come out of traditional Jacksonian populism. Hemisphere first, paying much more attention to the Western Hemisphere than his predecessors. A sense of prioritizing middle America, the average American, that's what foreign policy and economic policy should be. Now, whether, obviously people can argue about whether or not he's succeeding, that's a very different one. But those are when he defends his policies, he goes to these Jacksonian themes, I think. And again, he sees Iran as a dangerous rival. His justifications talk about all the Americans it's killed in past wars, going back really to the hostage crisis, the things that, not Iran is a threat to democracy worldwide, but Iran is an enemy of the United States and has demonstrated that over and over again, and we can't let them have nuclear weapons.
Right. What did the administration's national security strategy, which was published last fall, tell us about the direction of Trump's foreign policy and, the Trump corollary, as some were calling it, that so many missed? What was there? Was there hints there about what was to come?
Well, I think, first of all, I don't myself think that Trump probably read the national security strategy. In general, America, it's mandated that the American government produce these strategies. That's sort of a congressional requirement. And so they do produce them. I don't think but nowhere is it mandated that you have to follow them.
Right. It's like party platforms.
Right. Yes. What it is, it represents the consensus of a group of people sitting around a particular table at a particular time. And you'll never, I don't think even once in the history of the United States has a government official faced with some crisis said, oh, let's see, what should we do? Oh, I know there's something about this in the national security strategy, and gone to the bookshelf and oh yes, right here on page 17, this is what we're going to do. That is not how the American government works now or has ever worked. I do think that we can see from some of the themes that were in that strategy, we can see some elements, the hemisphere first, the concern, but the hemisphere first, a lot of people said, oh, well, this is isolationism, but it's sort of couched in terms of the Chinese, of external threats to America itself through the hemisphere. So at a rising time, at a time when international tensions, great power competition is rising, okay, we need to clean up our own backyard first so that we don't have these vulnerabilities. But that doesn't mean that you stop there. That's a starting point, not an ending point. So I think on the whole, the way to understand the national security doctrines of the Trump administration is to look at what it does more than what it says.
Yeah. Well, U.S.-European relations seem to be at an all-time post-World War II low. But even if, obviously Trump has treated the Europeans with some degree of contempt, and the Europeans seem weak and will neither pay for its own defense nor follow America's lead, where does this leave the EU and NATO with respect to the United States? Is this heading inevitably to the crack up of NATO, do you think?
Well, I think, the world is full of a lot of fossilized international institutions. people who have jobs in the NATO headquarters would like to continue cashing their paychecks. And, there are lots of organizations, international organizations, what is it, the CSCE, OSCE or something, where they haven't done anything for a very long time, but they do pay their staff. So in that sense, I don't think NATO is going anywhere. The question is, how much energy does it have? How much relevance does it have? And its relevance is, in political terms, is mostly about the Russian threat to Europe. And as that grows or diminishes, the importance of NATO in American and European thinking grows and diminishes. A lot of people criticize the United States for not being sufficiently attentive to NATO. I myself would like to see a bit more of a positive attitude from the Trump administration here. But until a couple of years ago, where you had European countries spending less than 1% or very minimal amounts on their own defense, that's a neglect of NATO. Showing, that is a profound, unmistakable demonstration of lack of interest in NATO when you don't think it's worth spending any money on.
Yeah.
In that sense, you can say that one result of Trump has been to revive NATO, in that Europeans are thinking about it now more than they were, more aware than before of their dependence on it, and also aware that it can't last unless they pay attention to it, and take proactive action to keep it going. Now, how they will resolve these debates among themselves and where it goes, we can't say. I do think that external events will drive a lot of that. What happens with the Russian war in Ukraine? What happens with the Chinese economic challenge to Europe? What happens, how does Europe resolve its fears of American tech companies with the reality that a modern economy needs certain capabilities that Europeans don't have and are nowhere close to producing? How do all of these things fit together? It's going to be a really complicated future. I think where some people in the MAGA universe get it wrong is they sort of think, well, we don't need diplomacy. In fact, I would say this very complexity of the future, say we do need diplomacy. We need people who can understand these realities. We need realistic diplomacies, reality-based diplomacy that is effective, is thoughtful, engages the partner, but is also clear about the national interest, clear about real security issues, less interested in kicking cans down the road than in creating a basis, a platform for constructive action moving forward.
Yeah, well, I think it's clear that this administration isn't the isolationist, administration that, some of its critics claimed it to be, and perhaps some of its supporters wanted it to be. It's something very different. And how that fits into with Europe and NATO, that's, I guess these are open questions.
Exactly. And the future will tell us what's going on. And the dynamics in this administration will start to change soon, and that we are now, we're past the 1/4 mark of Trump's second term. The midterms, it's still too early to predict how they'll turn out, although a lot of the indicators point to some big Democratic wins, certainly in the House and maybe in the Senate. But in any case, as President Trump approaches the end of his second term, what happens to his power in the Republican Party? What happens to the balance of power in Congress? How is public opinion shifting? These things will start to have a much bigger impact on the thinking of officials and what is and isn't possible in American foreign policy as well as domestic. Now, I think President Trump will continue, like many second-term presidents, will find that the fact that you have more constitutional freedom of action in foreign policy makes that even a more attractive venue for you in your second term than in your first.
Yeah.
Classically, in a second term, by then presidents sort of have more confidence in their judgment internationally. They know the other leaders in a way they didn't in their first terms. They've taken the measure of the national security establishment, found their allies, and so on. In all of these ways, Trump is actually, those elements of the Trump administration are somewhat classical, that second terms are more foreign policy focused, and you see a president more engaged with trusting his instincts. It's just that Trump's instincts are so unconventional that it looks weird, but in some ways it actually conforms to historical patterns.
Yeah. Now, looming over everything in U.S. foreign policy is the threat of China and what some call a new Cold War. Do you think China gains or loses from what's going on in Iran? And what does the outcome of that conflict portend for that rivalry, regardless of whether the United States walks away from it as the perceived victor or perceived loser?
Well, I think the thing that, if I were sitting in Beijing and playing the Chinese hand, the thing that would strike me the most about all of this, it would remind me how dependent I still am on Middle East oil and how little control I have on events in the Middle East. Will Chinese oil be able to get through the Straits of Hormuz? That's Iran has a vote and America has a vote. China doesn't really have a vote on that right now. That would make me think, okay, I'm going to increase my investments in renewables. I'm going to increase my investments in coal mines. I'm going to promote more pipelines into Central Asia and so on. I'm going to double down on my efforts to free my economy as far as I possibly can from dependence on potentially insecure lines of supply. I think, that is certainly something the Chinese will think.
Yeah.
And I can certainly imagine them thinking that they're going to continue to try to deepen partnerships with others in the Middle East, so that the next time there's a crisis of this magnitude, 5-10 years down the road or whatever, China may have more of a vote than it has right now, because right now China is not particularly relevant at this moment to what's happening in the Middle East.
Yeah, and by allying itself with Iran, it certainly, has very little say over what the United States is doing.
And it also risks the problem, if it doesn't help Iran, the question for a lot of countries is, why would I ever want to be China's friend? Because China's useless if you're in trouble. But if it does too much for Iran, then you have the Saudis and the Emiratis and the Omanis. Wait a minute, I thought you were our friend. I thought you wanted to be our friend and our customer. Why are you helping my mortal enemy who's trying to kill me?
Yeah.
So there's not a clear path for China through this mess.
Well, Mr. Mead, thanks so much for joining us today and for all of your insights. How can our audience follow your work?
Well, you can certainly take a look at my column, which comes out in the Wall Street Journal online, Monday evenings, U.S. time, and the print edition Tuesday morning. In big emergencies, I sometimes write 2 columns, as I did the week this war started. I also have a podcast of my own, What Really Matters. I think shorter and maybe less ambitious than your podcast, but that's a place that people can find us. It comes out through Tablet Magazine, and you can find it through Spotify and so on. You can also take a look at my Twitter account at WRMead, where I tweet out things of interest that I see and links to articles and so on. But and search the web. I'm out there.
Okay. Well, I do recommend, certainly for our audience, to be following your work. It's really invaluable.
And it's still true. Not enough people have read Ark of the Covenant. So Ark of a Covenant.
Yes. I think I recommended it 4 years ago, and I would, as I was looking back on it this week, still a really very important read.
No, thank you.
Well, we also want to thank our audience. Please remember to tune in every day for Jonathan Tobin Daily Edition, which you can hear wherever you get your podcasts. And whether you're listening to us on one of those platforms or watching us live on Facebook or X or on the JNS YouTube channel, please like and or subscribe to JNS, click on the bell for notifications, and give us good reviews. Please write to us at thinktwice@jns.org and let us know where you listen or watch the show and what you think about it. And remember, keep reading and thinking for yourself, and we'll see you again next week.